share a few words about Greenlight Guru before we get into the presentation and why we put on these free training sessions. Improving the quality of life for our customers and their patients is our mission here at Greenlight Guru, which is likely a similar mission as many of you who are attending today's webinar. We're constantly looking for ways to fulfill that mission, whether that's through hosting these free training sessions, improving the quality of life for our customers and their patients, which is partnering with world-class medical device consultants like Kyle here through our award-winning quality management software solution. At Greenlight Guru, everything we do is to enable your success. From streamlining your processes to helping your company overcome regulatory challenges and succeed in the market, Greenlight Guru's modern QMS and EDC software solutions are built specifically for medical device companies to improve speed and efficiency while reducing risk. Over 1,000 of the world's leading medtech companies trust Greenlight Guru, and we're ready to take your company to the next level. So if you're ready, head on over to www.greenlight.guru after today's presentation to get your personalized one-on-one demo of the only solution built exclusively for medical devices. All right. Let me give a proper introduction to your presenter today, Kyle Rose. Kyle is a medical device expert specializing in development of efficient quality systems from startups to large medical device companies. As president of Rook Quality Systems, Kyle works as a quality manager and advisor for over 100 medical device companies, overseeing overall quality strategy and ensuring compliance through quality engineering support and auditing services. Kyle is also a certified quality auditor, and he has regulatory and audit experience from a variety of markets, including the FDA, CE Mark, MDSAP, and other markets. Under Kyle's leadership, the Rook Quality Systems team is made up of over 30 quality engineers with a US and Taiwan branch to help our clients around the world maintain compliance. Okay, now for the part you've all been waiting for, the featured content of today's webinar. It's my pleasure to hand it over to your presenter, Kyle. Go ahead and take it away, Kyle.
Awesome. Thanks, Etienne. Looking forward to hosting today's webinar and great to partner with Greenlight and yourself again. Always super excited to do these webinars and very grateful that you guys asked me to come back and present. Today's topic is how to create your DHF and technical file and risk management file for hardware or software medical device. So high level umbrella, we're going to cover what the key aspects of your design history file and technical file are and how to make sure you're complying with the regulations as you're developing your product. Quick overview on Greenlight. So as most of you know, Greenlight is the leading EQMS software in the market. They support thousands of medtech companies around the world, 1,700 510K clearances and CE mark devices, 2,000 plus ISO certifications, and thousands of customer approvals and audits passed, trusted by leading medtech companies globally. Rook works very closely with Greenlight, and we have partnered with them since 2015, so going on 8 years now, and is our main EQMS solution that we recommend. A lot of key activities in Greenlight, but design and risk are definitely, I think, the forefront of your EQMS tool and the reason that a lot of customers choose Greenlight. In this webinar, we're going to be talking through the overview of the medical device regulations, when to start your design history file, so kind of timeline around when to begin. This is a question we get a lot with a lot of our startup clients. When to begin your design control, when to begin your risk, when is too early, when is too late, kind of talk through some of those timelines. Into your design and risk plans and how those relate to your design history file or technical file. We'll talk a little bit specifically around risk analysis and your hazard analysis and FMEA. Through V&V activities. So once you're to the point where you're ready to test your device, when do you start that? How does that go? The risk review, how this relates to your actual regulatory submission. So your 510K or FDA submission, as well as your technical file or CE mark submission. And then some key differences for software devices and their technical files and risk files. We'll touch on that as well. The majority of the presentation will cover all types of medical devices and things that need to be done for all types of medical devices, but we will cover specific software related activities there at the end and have some touch points as well as discussion on what's needed for software devices as well. Before we get too far into it, I do want to touch on some of these acronyms and definitions. As part of the med device industry, there's a lot of acronyms, a lot of definitions that we will just say quickly and assume that everybody knows what we're talking about. So I wanted to touch on some of these before we get too far into the process. So design history file is the design file that you create for your specific device. DHF is acronym. TF for technical file, CER for clinical evaluation report, RMF risk management file, PHA or HA, this refers to your preliminary hazard analysis or hazard analysis, or it's a risk analysis tool that we'll cover in more detail. We have FMEA, which is a failure modes and effects analysis. And then RMP, RMR, so the risk management plans and reports. So these are some very common acronyms that are used and will be covered in this presentation. So just wanted to touch on these as we get going. So I want to talk a little bit about the regulations and how they relate and how they differ for each device as well as each different region. So FDA is the outline for medical device system regulations here in the United States. These are outlined in 21 CFR 820 and cover what's required for your quality management system, but also touch on what's required for your design history file. ISO has 1345, which is the quality management system requirements, as well as 14971, which is the risk management standard for medical devices. We'll touch on both of these in more detail as well. These are the international backbone for quality systems. So the majority of international countries use these regulations to outline what's required for your quality system. And they also outline what's required for your design files and design control activities of your medical device. And then the EU MDR is the other kind of well-known and common regulation that is related to devices in the EU. This outlines specifications for QMS, technical file, and risk management, and is built on the foundation of 1345 and 14971. So a lot of the foundation of the EU MDR is from these two standards. Additionally, as some of you might know, there is a planned merger of 21 CFR 820 and 1345 into the QMSR regulations. Plans have been announced by the FDA last year, and there's a plan later this year to give more detail on that specific timeline. We're not going to cover that in a ton of detail today. I know there's been other podcasts and webinars that have talked about that, but that is a thing that is coming as well. Specifically for the DHF and risk file, we've put this table together that outlines the different phases from FDA, ISO, and MDR, and where they are covered in each section. So with the FDA, you have the specific requirements for your design history file, and that design history file term is really focused on the FDA and products in the US market. So this has requirements for design and development planning, design inputs, design outputs, design reviews, design verification and validation, design transfer, and design changes. So these items are called out specifically in 21 CFR and outline what's required for your design history file, as well as procedures related to these activities. The risk management file and risk activities are not super well defined in the current 21 CFR regulations, but 14971 is a recognized standard for FDA, and there are additional guidances that outline how to use risk in your development activities. As far as ISO 1345, section 7.3 outlines the requirements for design and development of your product. This includes, very similar to FDA, all of the same phases for planning, inputs and outputs, design review, V&V, transfers and changes. ISO also references 14971, and this covers in more detail your risk management plan, risk analysis, risk evaluation, risk controls, evaluation, risk review, and then post activities. So this is the full standard that covers all of the risk requirements for the development and ongoing changes and then release of your medical device. And then MDR has additional regulations that are, again, built on 1345 and 14971, but go into more detail as well. So this is called out Annex 1 and 2 regarding your technical file and what is required for the technical file, as well as what's required for your risk file, in addition to what is in 14971. A lot of these changes on the risk file or requirements are tied to more of your post-market evaluation, post-market controls, and how that needs to tie back into your risk management process and ongoing risk management activities. The technical file is something that's not specifically defined as much in ISO as it is in MDR. So specifically, if you need details on your technical file and how that needs to be created, that information is more in the EU MDR regulations than it is in 1345. So for anyone that's very new to the process and trying to find out, where to look for different requirements, this gives you a good idea of what you need to look for and where for any of your device development, technical file, design history file creation activities. All right, so now we're going to talk a little bit about the DHF activities, so design control, timeline, and planning per 1345 and FDA regulations. So with the design activities, this is kind of an initial phase of when to begin design and when to start documenting what's required for your device. Like I said in the intro, this is a question that we get a lot from a lot of our companies. Rook works very closely with startup companies and early stage medical device companies, and Greenlight does as well. And one of the questions we always get asked is, when do we start design control? Is it too early, too late? How much documentation should we have? And so that's something I do want to touch on here with this slide, is when to begin that design control process. So formally, your design control needs a high-level procedure that defines design control, and that's something that should be included as you're starting to create your medical device company and actual device, is your high-level quality system procedures specifically for pre-market. Pre-market procedures are something that tie specifically to all the activities you're going to do as you're developing your device and getting it ready to go through clearance, whether that's FDA or CE or some other market. So with the pre-market side, design control is one of the key procedures you'd want in your quality system at the very early stage of creating your company and starting to think about your medical device. As you begin to iterate on the device and kind of work in this R&D phase, this is when you need to start identifying some user needs and design inputs. User needs are the high-level, non-technical explanation of the design needs and tie specifically to what the user is looking for your device. And then design input relate directly to your user needs, but are more technical and call out specifications or things that can be tested against. So as you're starting to develop your device and moving from the R&D phase into more of a prototype manufacturing and testing phase, this is really when you need to really dive in to make sure you have your user needs, you have your design plan, and you have your design inputs. One kind of rule I've started saying recently is the version of your device that you think is going to be kind of the last version before you build enough to test. So as you're going through your design phases and your R&D activities, you keep iterating, you're getting closer and closer, and you think, oh, this might be the final one. We're ready for design freeze and ready to build. That's really the latest point that you should go without moving forward with formal documentation. So the version right before design freeze or code freeze for software is the version that really needs to have this heavy focus on documentation for your design control activity. So, and that would include your design plan, your user needs, design inputs, things like that. This specifically ties to startup companies that are doing this for the first time and have not worked in a medical device quality system in the past and are kind of starting from scratch. With more established companies, bigger companies, the majority of the time you will have to have these things in place before you can even start working on a project. You'll have to have a design plan and user needs and a project roadmap, all of those things before you can start. But this is specifically for startups and the ones that ask pretty frequently, when do we start design control? How late is too late? All of that type of stuff. So the product before moving design freeze is really where you want to start with these design plan, user need, design input activities. I wouldn't go any further before starting that formal documentation. Throughout the design process, there'll be different stages for design reviews. So these are formal reviews that cover certain aspect of your design and things that were created. So this can be a review of just your user needs, just your design inputs. This can also be a review of certain components of the device. Say you have one aspect of the device that's already finished and you might still be working on the software side, but the hardware is finished. You can go ahead and create a design review for the hardware and do the design review on the software later. This is really a great feature with the components in Greenlight Guru in their project workflow, where you can actually do design reviews for different phases as you're moving along. So you can lock down your user needs and inputs for a certain component of the device, do that design review, and still keep working on other aspects of the device. Other aspects of the design that will be done further down the road, post-design freeze. This would be your design outputs. So these are your actual instructions and records of how the device will be built. So this can be drawing files, material specifications, source code, wireframes, work instructions, labeling, IFU. Any of these things are considered design outputs. So once you have the design frozen, you have your design inputs specified. Design outputs are then kind of what's next. And then you move into the testing and design phase. Obviously, you don't want to get to testing without documenting everything before that, because there'd be a lot of gaps on what might have been missed through that development phase. Here we have kind of the FDA design control waterfall diagram. This is very well known, used in a lot of med device and procedures, things like that. Wanted to highlight how this all works together and how the different phases align. So this also has a very good indication of when you need to complete your design reviews throughout the different phases of development. So user needs, high level requirements tied to your user. Those then get transferred into design inputs. So you should have clear traceability between each of these phases in your design matrix or in your EQMS, such as Greenlight Guru does with their projects. So user needs tied to design inputs. Design inputs should have specifications or something you can test against. They can reference external standards. They can reference internal specifications you've developed. This then feeds into kind of the formal design process. So we define specifically how the device needs to work, how accurate it needs to be, what size it is, all of these features of the design in our design inputs. Then we finalize the design process and have the design outputs. Design outputs, again, would be your drawing files, your schematics, your wireframes of your software, your source code, anything that shows specifically how the device works, how it's built, and this then leads into your DMR record as well. Once you get to design outputs, that then prompts you to the design verification. So this is the process of actually verifying your device, showing that the design outputs meet your design inputs, whether that's testing to make sure your device gets the correct result, it meets biocompatibility standards, it meets whatever standards apply to your device. That verification loop is verifying the outputs meet the inputs. Once you pass that, it's then on to validation. And that is showing that the device meets the user requirements and is a safe and effective device to put on the market. So that is kind of the follow-up loop of this whole process is the design validation going back to your user needs. Again, each of these phases should have a formal design review with signatures, minutes, and according to ISO, you also need an independent reviewer at each of these phases as well. The design reviews are key to make sure that everyone is aware of where the design is at and it's formally documented. These records will be reviewed during audits. So it's key to have these design reviews as you go. So even at a very early stage, you want to make sure you're capturing design reviews with the development of your product. So I want to touch a little bit about the actual design plans and how that relates to your design history file and what content needs to be in this design plan. So per 1345, as well as FDA regulations, design and development needs to be planned, and the following activities should be documented formally in your design plan. So assignment of responsibilities and authorities. So who is going to be involved in the design and what their roles are. So this includes, quality, it includes regulatory, includes manufacturing, development of both hardware and software, project manager. Any of these types of roles should be defined in your design plan. The design and development stages. So just using the phases we looked at previously, user needs, inputs, outputs, those can be used. Some companies also use phase 0 to phase 5 approach, and there's different ways to outline the design stages for your product, but that should be clearly defined in your design plan. Specifically for software, there's also requirements of your design and development plan that will need to be called out, such as environment, what coding languages you're using, if there's any other external libraries or tools that are being used, any of your sprint cycles for development, those activities should be called out in your design and development plan as well. Reviews needed at each stage. So you would call out when you need to have your design review and who needs to be involved. Like we just showed in the previous diagram, that should be at kind of each stage of the user needs, inputs, outputs, and V&V. You can also include risk review stages as well. You want to identify what type of verification and validation will be done, and then when design transfer will be done. Traceability of your design development, so how it's going to be traced and what the key outputs will be for each stage, and then necessary resources as well as the competency of the personnel involved. So all this information should be captured in your design plan and should be created when you start the project. So when you start this new device development, you want to capture design plans at that time. One of the key things and a gap we see a lot of times with companies is they start this design plan early on, but they don't maintain it as they go. So it's also a requirement that you maintain your design plan as you move forward into the different phases of your design. So good practice, update it as much as you can, but at end of the month or start of the new month, so we just started March, go back and review your design plan every month. Just make sure you are updating it as you go. This is something you can keep a very efficient revision table in there. That doesn't have to be too complicated, just saying that you've reviewed it and it's up with the current status of the design. If you did make changes, documenting what was changed. In some cases, this might not need to go through a formal change order. It's something that can be maintained as a living record in your quality system as well. But just making sure that it is updated with the current status of design. Also, if you are expecting an audit, making sure that you go back and look at your design plans and make sure they're all current as well, because those will be reviewed in your audit as well. So as we talked about the different design and development stages, we wanted to highlight again on the screen what needs to be done at each stage and what the key outputs are as well. So first, with the design and development planning, we have our design plan creation, and that's a formally approved document. We'll identify the scope of the project device. In some cases, and I think as a best practice, we also recommend that you include the regulatory path in there as well. And this can even be tied to your V&V plan. So you can have this as part of your design document as well, is have your formal testing plan as well as your formal regulatory plan that would call out potentially what classification and product code you would be in the US, what rule you classify, what classification you would have under, say, EU MDR or Health Canada or something like that. You would call out the specific rules for your classification and then what classification your device would be. So all that information can be in those plans as well. The design inputs would define both your user needs and then tying into your inputs. This process also needs to have formal review and sign off as you move forward. Depending on how complicated your device is, This can be multiple components that have their own user needs and design inputs. In some cases, companies might also not be sure on their design inputs, right? They don't know what the specification is. So there might be tests that need to be done to really define the specifications before you can finalize your design input. Design output. So this would be identifying clearly what your design outputs are, linking them in your matrix to your design inputs, but also reviewing and signing off on those outputs as well. So any of these drawing files, any of these material specifications, schematics, data sheets for any electrical components of your device, those should be formally captured in your quality system, signed off and approved, and then linked in your design matrix. This is another reason we love Greenlight so much, is all of these activities are very easily accomplished and easy to link together. You can clearly upload all your design outputs, sign off on them in Greenlight, and then link them back into your design output section in your matrix of Greenlight. Again, design review at kind of each one of these stages to make sure you're formally having these reviewed. Design V&V activities. So this is identifying that you're testing, what you're testing, and where it'll be documented. In some cases, your verification protocols can cover multiple inputs or multiple outputs. You can have one protocol that covers multiple things. Validation is typically more inclusive of all user needs, so it is a test that covers a lot of user needs together. Once these activities are done, that's when you typically move into design transfer. Design transfer is the actual process of moving from a prototype or small scale manufacturing into a higher volume manufacturing. So this can be something that's done internally with your own facility and own manufacturing, or it could be something where you built a prototype and now you're moving it to a different contract manufacturing location where higher volume. The reason design transfer is really considered part of the DHF and design control activities is because typically when you move to design transfer, there's going to be tweaks and changes to your device. So you want to make sure that those are formally captured in your quality system and documented properly as you go. Design transfer activities don't have to happen right away. In some cases, companies go through the design V&V activities and sign off on their device and then submit their 510K. And that might take a few months or longer. And then once the 510K is cleared, then they would go into design transfer. So design transfer doesn't have to happen right away. It can be something that happens after you have formal clearance from FDA, CE mark, whatever it might be. Specifically with the V&V activities, this is where we're testing internally to make sure the device works. If we say the device needs to weigh less than 2 pounds, we need to put it on a scale and test it. If we say the device battery needs to last for 4 days, we need to turn it on and charge the battery and make sure it lasts for 4 days in various conditions, right? So we need to have all of these formal tests of our device showing it works. Key thing with verification activities is it needs to be documented before we start testing on what is going to be done, how we're going to test it, and specifically what the acceptance criteria is. We can't go into a test just saying, oh, we're going to see what happens and then decide if it passes or fail. We need to have a clearly defined acceptance criteria and pass-fail justification before we start any of this verification testing. So all this internal bench testing should be formally documented with protocols. These protocols should be reviewed and approved internally, so as part of your quality system activities before you start testing. This applies to software as well. This is one of the big gaps we see with software devices, especially companies going into med device software that have never done medical device software in the past, is that they say they've tested the device, they claim everything's working, but they don't have any formal documentation of the testing. So having same idea of formal test cases, formal testing scripts that you're going to execute that define pass-fail criteria, define environment, define who the tester is, all of those things need to be documented before you start formal verification testing for hardware and software. Verification activities can also include external testing, so things like your biocompatibility testing, your 60601 testing, cybersecurity testing, FCC, Bluetooth, wireless connectivity, any of those things can also be part of your verification. Even though they're done externally, there should be formal protocols that are developed by the test lab and then tested for your device. Each of these should be approved, and then when verification is done, also have a design review showing that all the proper people reviewed these output of the results of your verification and signed off on these activities. Validation is more tied to the overall intended use and user needs. Did we make the right device for what the user need is? So this can be actual clinical testings, clinical trials of end users actually using the device in the field or in a simulated environment. This must be done under actual intended conditions, how it's going to be used. So if you're making a device that's going to be used at home, it should be used in a home environment. Validation activities can also include your usability evaluation and human factors. So going and giving users observing them using the device can also be part of your validation. Formal packaging and labeling of the final product should also be included in your validation activities. Once again, once validation is completed, you need to have another design review and show that this was all reviewed as part of your packet of your design control activities. That's kind of the overall process on design control and your DHF. We're going to talk a little bit about how this ties to risk activities. These are both intertwined and should be happening at the same time, but we just kind of split them out for this presentation to focus on each one separately. Risk management, like we said, the main standard is this ISO 14971 standard that covers the requirements of risk analysis. There's also additional standards, the 24971 is the implementation of this, and there's a new cybersecurity evaluation part of the 34971 as well. The guidance on risk management for AI and ML devices. All right, so similar to your design control activities, risks should start early in your development and ideation of your new device. This starts with a plan. So similar to how we talked about with your design plan, you should also have a risk plan that covers key aspects of the risk analysis process, who's involved, things like that. Based on the type of the device and the complexity of the device, you'll have different risk analysis tools that are used for your device. ISO 14971 standard specifically calls out the use of a hazard analysis and a risk analysis method that is aligned with the standard to cover potential harms to the user or the people that are administering the device or test, and anything that could go wrong as far as user harm. That is the key requirement from the standards to have this hazard analysis. In some cases, depending on the device and complexity of the device, you might need to also supplement with other types of risk analysis. FMEA is a very common one for this type of risk analysis. Fault tree analysis and other tools can also be used to align with the standard and provide additional risk analysis at different phases. We'll cover that later on this section on when to implement FMEA and when a hazard analysis might be enough for your type of device. Once you've kind of completed the initial analysis phases, there's the ongoing process of risk evaluation and risk control. Evaluation is actually the scoring of your risks or harms and how they relate to your actual device. And then risk control will be linking this back to your design control to show how you have mitigated risk. This is another key feature of Greenlight Guru, where you're able to actually interactively link these items between risk of your hazard analysis and your design control in the system, and then show how you've reduced the risk of any of these features, whether they're reducing the severity or probability of certain failures or harms to either end user or patient. Some of these control considerations can be safety by design, protective measures, information that's provided, such as labeling, instructions for use, things like that. So this is kind of the key phase of going back and reviewing. Oh, we found all these risks. how do we address them? What can we do to make this device safer for our users? So that's really that control process is key. Post design freeze, we have activities for risk review and risk reports. So summarizing risk activities after V&V activities, going back to see if anything's changed, if we can reduce risk any further. Also ongoing risk activities. So once your device is on the market, you're going to learn a lot more about the risks of your device once new people and untrained users start using the device. So you're going to be able to go back and account for those risks as well. Similar to what I discussed on the design side is kind of when to start these activities. Similar answer as the initial question with the design is very early in your device. Do you want to start to have your risk management plan and your hazard analysis? The hazard analysis is really key, similar to how the user needs and inputs are key, because you want to identify what standards and what key risks are part of your device, because it's going to change drastically from a class 1 device to a class 3 device, a hardware device to a software device or a mechanical sterile device. All of these have key risk profiles that need to be captured and documented, and these will affect your design choices, right? So on what materials you can use, what testing you have to do, these have to be identified early in the process so you don't waste time, you don't skip steps, you don't have to go back and update some testing or things like that. So starting your hazard analysis and your risk management plan very, very early in the process is highly recommended for any type of device. Touching a little bit on actual risk plans and what's required for your risk plan. So this is, again, very similar to the design plan. It should have identified the scope of the risk management activities, assignment of responsibilities and authorities. So again, who's going to be the project lead, who has different roles as far as quality and regulatory. In some cases, companies will bring in a clinical advisor and have them participate in some of these risk activities as well. So they'll have some sort of doctor, clinician review the potential harms, review the scoring, and provide their feedback in risk management activities as well. Also, same with engineering team, manufacturing team. These people should be considered part of the risk team as well, because there are risks specific to development, specific to manufacturing that need to be accounted in your risk review as well. Review the requirements of your risk plan. So what types of risk analysis are you going to do? When are you going to do them? And kind of putting these in your plan is also required. The risk acceptability criteria. So this is key as well. So identifying what the key scoring method is and what needs to be the main milestone or acceptability for moving forward with the product. So if you have a class 1 product, you probably can't have a lot of critical and high risk areas with your class 1 device. So you want to identify, based on the classification or risk profile of your device, what the risk acceptability criteria is, and then what to do if you do have a risk that's in the higher than identified area. So if you have a risk that is too high, what do you need to do before you can move forward with the specific phase of that product? Whether that's design changes, do you need to have a risk benefit analysis? All of those things need to be defined in your risk management plan. Also, this should be tied back to your high-level procedure for risk as well. The residual risk evaluation method, verification activities, and effectiveness of risk controls. So once you have controls in place, you need to go back and verify they're actually working. And then how you're going to collect and review activities for post-production risk. Another thing that's not clearly defined here is when you should review risk. Similar to design reviews, you should also have planned risk reviews as well. So that can be at different phases of your risk review, or once certain things are done, having those formally reviewed as well. So now we'll talk a little bit about actually using your hazard analysis and your FMEA, when those apply, and when to implement either of these tools as well. So the hazard analysis is focused on specifically harms, starting with potential hazards, foreseeable events, hazard situations, and harms, and how these relate to your actual device. So this graphic, the hazard should be at the start, but hazards are predefined from 14971. So in Annex C, there's actually a list of hazards that you should consider. It's a really great way to get started, is just to go through this list and say, is there a risk of biocompatibility or cytotoxicity? Is there a risk of electrical shock? Is there a risk of cybersecurity or data loss? So going through specific for your device and identifying, yes, no, do these hazards apply specifically to our device? That then ties to a foreseeable event, as to, we have a material that, or a device that's going to be patient contacting. So there is a situation where that material could cause some sort of irritation or sensitization from the user. And so we need to identify what the foreseeable event is, and then what the hazard situation is, and then potential harm to the end user, which could be, an infection, it could be an allergic reaction, some toxic reaction, whatever it might be. So these things need to be captured in this hazard analysis, from initial hazard, foreseeable event, hazard situation, and harm. Each of these things should be captured and documented. So this activity has a lot of hypotheticals, a lot of really diving into each component of your device and each use case of your device and what could go wrong. As I talked about earlier, the hazard analysis is really the requirement from 14971, and this is something that must be done. This is not an option for your device. It's not an optional activity. This is required and must be done for your risk analysis to be complete. The FMEA is optional, but also typically something we recommend depending on the product. In some cases, you can complete all of your risk analysis just through a hazard analysis activity and not need any more risk analysis. But in some cases, FMEA is also required or needed. So that's the high level hazard analysis. This is another thing that is really well defined in Greenlight. They provide this Annex C already in the software, and then allow you to clearly define your foreseeable events, hazard situations, and harms. Harms you then score with severity and probability, and that gives them an overall risk rating. So these things should be defined in your risk plan and then documented in your risk analysis matrix to show all the potential hazards, potential foreseeable events, hazard situations, and harms for your device, and then how those have been mitigated. And then how that ties to FMEA. So an FMEA is a separate risk analysis tool that focuses specifically on potential failures for a certain aspect of your device or process of your device. So FMEAs can be around your design. So this would be something that would be conducted specifically looking at your bill of materials. What would happen if this PCB failed, or this adhesive didn't work properly? How would that affect the end user of the device, as well as how would we know when we receive this device if it's defective? So the main way that we use a design FMEA at Rook and recommend our clients to use it is tied to the actual bill of materials and incoming inspection, as to how do we know this material or component is what it needs to be, and if it failed, how would we find out? And that then ties us to identify what level of testing we need at incoming inspection, what risk to assign each component, and then what additional testing might be needed. The use FMEA or UFMEA is specifically tied to the end user or the usability studies. So identifying all of the critical tasks tied to the use of your device, and then identifying what could go wrong. That'll help you identify any potential needs to update your labeling, instructions for use, QRI, any of these things, quick start guide. These things would be outlined in your use FMEA and then captured in that formal record. Software FMEA can be used to define specific failure modes tied to actual software bugs, software architecture, data transfer, external software libraries, things like that. One of the key things to account for in the software FMEA is a specific P1, P2 requirement of 14971 and also tied in 62304 standards is how to evaluate probability of specific software bug failures. So if you do have a software device and you're doing risk analysis, you want to make sure that the P1, P2 is accounted for in your risk analysis. A process FMEA is the step of evaluating the actual manufacturing process to see what could cause failures. So looking at the perspective of the operator actually assembling or creating your device, what could happen if they don't, do this step properly, if they don't heat this part correctly, if they don't seal them together or do whatever they're supposed to do. If that fails, what would happen and how likely would we know? So these are things where the FMEA model can be used and incorporated. In some cases, this can also be done in a hazard analysis. If you do plan to use a FMEA, it should be clearly defined in your risk plan how any new hazards from your FMEA activity will be circled back into your hazard analysis. So you want to have that key aspect of we have an FMEA to dive deep on this process, but we'll circle it back into our hazard analysis as well to see if it relates to any specific harms to the user. So FMEA can be more focused on just failures, whereas the hazard analysis covers any specific harms to the end user. All right. So once we've completed these risk activities, we need to have some sort of risk review that covers all of the risk activities that were completed and what needs to be done prior to product release. So the risk review will review the actual risk plan to make sure everything was completed that was supposed to. We'll review the benefit risk analysis as well as all of the risks that were captured in the device. So your risk management report would have actual outline of we had this many low risk, this many medium, this many high. For the medium and high, we did these activities to reduce the risk. We did this benefit risk analysis report, and this is what was done to show how these potential high or medium risks are okay to use the device. So the benefit of using the device outweighs these high and medium risks. So all that information should be captured in your risk management report and be ready for review for a potential auditor, potential 60601 will also review these types of documents and potentially FDA as well. Once the kind of initial risk report is done, that's kind of a signed off activity. But as I talked about earlier, risk review is an ongoing activity that never ends. So as we get product on the market, you're going to get notification, whether that's through complaints or word of mouth or whatever it might be, user feedback that new risks can happen. Something might have happened that you didn't plan for, didn't capture in your hazard analysis. So you want to go back and review this. You should also do proactive post-market surveillance. So this is a much bigger requirement in EU MDR, but something that can also be done specifically in the US is also a requirement. So reviewing mod database or other tools to see what risks have happened to similar devices and make sure you account for those in your risk report as well. So any new unrecognized hazards or hazard situations, updating any potential severity or probability that might have changed. If you did see a big uptick in certain reports on a certain harm and you thought the probability was lower than it actually turned out to be, then you want to update that in your risk file as well. It's very key that you are ongoing and proactive with your risk management activities and maintaining your risk review going forward. The state of the art is also a key aspect for EU MDR, and that should be captured in your risk management report or in your technical file as well. So that was kind of the bundle on design and risk from a high level and how to incorporate those two key features into your design file and your risk management file. As we talked about at the start, we did want to touch on specifics for your software devices. So any company that have a pure SAMD product or a device that has software SIMD with it. So more and more, Rook clients, Greenlight clients are having software devices, and want to make sure that they know kind of the key differences and key similarities between a design history file for a hardware traditional device or a software device. One of the key things to say, just kind of high level, is a lot of this stuff is shared between both. So documentation of user needs or user requirements, design inputs or software requirements, all of that should be documented. All your risks should be documented, all your design reviews, all of these activities should be documented in the way it was just described earlier in this presentation. The software development plan can be in addition to your design plan, but it also should describe things like environment, code language, sprint timeline, all of those things, testing requirements specific to your software development. Some additional requirements would be configuration management plan, your software architecture, software development plan or deployment plan, as well as your SOUP documentation for your software. These things should have specific templates and then generate records for each software developed, whether there's firmware as well as user interface software or just a standalone product. You might have to have multiple documents for each. Risk management will also have our level of concern and safety classification. So the level of concern is a document specifically from the FDA on how they group software in moderate, major classification. And then we have a safety classification from 62304. And then you should also have a cybersecurity risk analysis. So in your 510K specifically, FDA will want you to identify specific cybersecurity risks that you identified in your high-level risk analysis and put those in a separate report specific for cybersecurity and how those have been addressed. This can also touch on specific cybersecurity testing you've done, things like that related to risk for cybersecurity as well. One key thing that we'll touch on a little bit in the 510K area is that with some devices, the user needs and inputs might not need to be shared with the FDA, and the risk analysis in some cases is not part of your 510K. But for software devices, that information will be included. So for software devices, it's even more urgent that you start documenting everything very early on, because your development plan, your version history, all the changes that have been made, all the testing, a lot of that information actually goes into your submission. So it's very key that you start that documentation on the design control activities of your software very, very early on. So if you have a software you're developing and you've never done this before and you need support, that's something that Rook Quality does a great job of stepping in and helping document your software properly as you go through development, identifying what testing to be done and documenting everything as you go. So the design history file and risk management file, we covered from a very high level, talking about what's required, kind of shared between all regulations. So FDA, ISO, what's required. We did want to touch a little bit on the technical file requirements and what is required for your specific technical file. So design history file, technical file, a lot of times are very similar. There are some differences. And so if you are getting ready for, say, a technical file review to achieve CE mark for your product, you're going to make sure you have these aspects. So within the technical file, we have these general requirements and then the specific annex or section that is detailing what is needed. So we have the general device description and specifications, device labeling, packaging, and instructions for use. So the final labeling, packaging, and instructions, including actual images of your label and the actual instructions for use. Detailed design and manufacturing documentation. So this would be all of your design control activities as well as your manufacturing. So tying back to your like DMR, how you make the device, that should be in your technical file. The general safety and performance requirements. So this GSPR activity is a risk management activity going through the template provided from the EU MDR regulations. that outlines different types of risk and whether or not they apply to your device. The risk management and risk benefit information, or benefit risk, it should also be included in your technical file. So the actual output of your risk plan, your hazard analysis and any FMEAs, and your benefit risk analysis and your risk report, this information will be in your technical file. The final product verification and validation information, post-market surveillance, as well as your post-market surveillance plan, and your declaration of conformity. So these things are, in some cases, included in your technical file, but they have specific formats, specific requirements tied to a technical file that need to be notified and implemented if you are working towards CE mark certification. The GSPR, just want to touch on these a little bit. You need to look at this section of the annex and go through each section of the GSPR and document evidence needed for each element or provide justification why it does not apply. So this will reference sections of your procedures, sections of your design control, sections of your risk management, and sections of your V&V within your actual GSPR record. And this will be reviewed in detail as part of your technical file review and potential audits as well. Also list what potential standards apply to your testing and apply to your device as part of the GSPR activities. Clinical evaluation report is also part of your technical file. So one of the key changes with MDR related to MDD was the need for more clinical data and proactive clinical data for a lot of devices in the scope of the EU. This requirement ties to specifically the clinical evaluation report and what needs to be in here. So identifying what clinical data you have, evaluating the status and quality of this clinical data, whether it's for your device specifically or a comparison device, and then having ongoing results of clinical evidence in your clinical evaluation report. This topic of clinical evaluation and post-market surveillance activities, very detailed. We've done previous webinars with Greenlight that go in much more detail on clinical evaluation reports and technical file creation, but just wanted to touch on that at a high level today as well. The post-market clinical follow-up activities also part of your technical file. So depending on your classification of product, you'll have different timelines for post-market activities. You want to make sure you are properly documenting these and meeting these requirements, having your plan in place, and then updating them as needed with the specific clinical data, clinical evidence, post-market feedback, all that stuff. Same with post-market surveillance. So having a formal process in place, having periodic reports for surveillance and safety, depending on the classification of your device as well. So each one would have requirements of when you need to do this every year, annually, just depends on your type of product. And then declaration of conformity. So once you have received conformity of your technical documentation from your notified body, you can sign off on your declaration of conformity. If you are a class 1, you can sign off once you've completed all of these activities internally. This would have details on your product, catalog, SRN, your sole responsibility statement, basic UDI of the device, risk classification, harmonized standards, notified body, place of issue, and person who will sign. So all that key information will need to be on your declaration of conformity, and this will need to be in your technical file as well. Other regulatory submissions and how this relates. So technical file is, considered a regulatory submission, but also wanted to touch on the DHF and how it relates to the 510K. Similar to what I brought up earlier, the DHF is your internal design activities and risk activities that you create and develop as you're creating this device. Only at a certain point, once you've completed design verification and validation, would you think about actually submitting your 510K, right? So you can't submit a 510K or PMA until the device has been formally tested and those test reports are ready for the FDA. So at a high level, your 510K or PMA typically covers your design inputs at a very high level, but mainly your design outputs and your design verification activity. It'll also have your intended use, your labeling and packaging of your device. Some of the things that may not be in your submission, but should be in your design control would be your user needs, your design inputs, and your risk analysis. A lot of times, risk analysis is not required for hardware devices or electrical devices, but it is required for software. So in your 510K, a lot of times it really is your design outputs, your verification and validation activity, your substantial equivalence argument, and then your labeling and packaging. So just want to be aware that you still need to do this stuff, but it might not all be in your 510K. A note here as well that the eStar program is very easy to use, and the template makes it very easier, more clear on how to document everything that's needed in your 510K and submit electronically. So if you do plan on submitting a 510K, definitely look at the eStar. It's something we've done quite a bit recently and can definitely help you with that eStar process as well. And then similar kind of question on what is required for your CE mark. So this actually has a lot more of your information. So the majority of your design history file will be in your technical file. Also, your technical file will be your design control process will be reviewed as part of the audits for your CE mark. So these will be reviewed previous to technical documentation or simultaneous to technical documentation as well. Risk management activities will be part of your technical file and also be reviewed as part of your audit. One key thing on the FDA pathway is you do not typically get audited prior to submitting your 510K. So a lot of this internal information around your quality system and design control is stuff you maintain internally, but is not submitted to the FDA with your 510K. So that is a question we get quite a bit. So just wanted to touch on that as well. That is it. So Etienne, I hope we got a lot of good questions. We do have our contact information here. If anybody wants to reach out and ask questions directly, we have the Rook general info email, my personal email, as well as our website to feel free to reach out with any questions.
Excellent. Thank you so much, Kyle. This was a lot, I know, and you're probably out of breath. So really appreciate the presentation. So we did get a lot of questions, and if you have additional questions, those of you in the chat, I know some questions came through. I tried to direct you to the Q&A. It's hard to catch everything, but go ahead and put those in the Q&A so I can easily get those. Also, if you want to look through the Q&A and vote, that kind of helps me prioritize what I want to ask Kyle. So Renee actually asked a question. For those of us who are in software as a medical device, what will qualify as design transfer, especially since no transfer of the software occurs, just installation?
Yeah, so the design transfer phase of software would be anything that we do to transfer it from like a test environment to an actual released environment, and how that process is done, whether that is an actual thing that's done on each specific device, or in the case of just a pure SAMD, making it available to the user. So moving it from your development environment to released code environment is kind of really that phase, and any documentation of that activity being done is what we would consider design transfer, and the documentation around that. It's not nearly as complicated as a traditional device that has physical hardware and needs to be manufactured, but it still should be captured and accounted for on software devices as well.
Okay. All right. Now that people know about the voting feature, people are voting. So let's keep going here. So another one. This one comes from Sarah, and can you see this on the bottom of the screen?
Yeah, I can. That's cool.
All right. How does the waterfall model for design and development fit best into agile development for software as a medical device?
Yeah, so the waterfall model of moving through user needs, inputs, and the one that showed still applies just in much smaller circles, right? For agile development. So in agile development, you're building one subset of the code, and you're going through the full waterfall in that specific sprint cycle, and doing testing, and then moving on to the next module or area of code development. So it's still a, it still fits into that model. It's just in the smaller circles that you're completing these activities, and then you have the kind of final validation of everything once it's done. So the circle of requirements, outputs, and testing for each specific agile section would still need to be documented and tested before you move forward into the next sprint. And then there's kind of final testing of everything once it's all done. And that agile development stuff is things we've taught a lot of companies on how to implement that properly, document that within your quality system, and train companies on agile med device development. So it's definitely something that we can follow up with as well.
Okay. Patricia asked the question, who qualifies as an independent reviewer in the design review process?
Yeah, it's somebody that should have sufficient training as far as the device itself and the high-level quality system and risk requirements, and then somebody who's not actively participating in the design activities, right? So somebody who's not like the engineer who's leading design or the manufacturing side. It's a role a lot of times companies will bring Rook into Phil that will be kind of an expert that can be that independent reviewer on design phases. But it can also be somebody internally that is just not part of the project, but has a high level understanding of that type of device and the QMS requirements.
All right. Very good. Thank you. The next one is from Ben. Can the risk reviews be conducted during the design reviews, or should you have separate documentation for each?
Yeah, you can definitely do them together. I think as long as you're just calling out which sections of the risk you're reviewing, you can definitely do them together. And any way we can make things more efficient when you have these set meetings and a lot of people together is recommended. So yeah, definitely a good activity to do those together.
Yeah, interesting thing to me about the design review, a lot of companies, they're basically calling what is maybe a stage review a design review. And the company can really review just about anything they want during that design review,
Yeah.
provided they are meeting the regulation. Yeah, that's great.
Yep.
Okay, let's see. Next question is from Divya. What are the methods for evaluating residual risk, and how to define residual risk acceptability criteria?
So this would be, after you have conducted your risk control activities, going back to review what the ongoing risk is, right? So you'll say that one of your potentially risk was biocompatibility. You chose a material that was biocompatible. You finished testing to show that it meets the requirements for biocompatibility. And so your residual risk would be theoretically lower, but it's not a zero risk, right? There still could be some user that has a reaction. So you still want to review that risk, post all the information of testing and design features to see where that risk stands and ongoing activity around any user feedback related to that risk. How to define that acceptance would really be in your plan and tie specifically to your device on what the risk profile is, right? Class 1 is going to be different than a class 3. So it would have to take in specifics for each device, but the just key aspects of going through everything once all the testing is complete, all the design features are complete, to see what residual risk were reduced and which ones still might be high. And that's just a known thing. And you need to go to your benefit risk analysis to see if you can release that product. So it's kind of a lot of being close to the product, but the formal documentation of that should be done.
Yeah, so ultimately, I mean, it's just it's an iterative process almost. So you've gone through your risk management, and we almost trip ourselves up with this word residual sometimes. It's just now you have another risk item, and you have to determine whether or not it fits into your existing risk acceptability criteria. Is that kind of accurate?
Yeah.
Yeah. Okay. Hopefully that answers the question. Appreciate that. Next one's from Carlos. Let me just go ahead and share it here. Can you provide examples of how companies you've worked with have documented software configuration management as part of design controls? For instance, is it documented as a design change for product and development and commercial products? And I think that may be from like software revisions, it sounds like.
Yeah, so this would be part of like ongoing design change activities once the product is released, I think is what she's asking. So you would have the configuration management plan in place on what you're going to do and how you're going to manage releases, and then have this software change control process documented once your product is in the commercial phase. The version control during the design phase should also be captured, right? So the FDA wants to see your unresolved anomalies and your version history and what was changed and how that related to any fixes. So all that should be documented in both design phase and post-market phase, as part of your plan and then your formal change control process.
And so I know some people talk about it, software changes relatively quickly. So I think one of the things that people question about is, well, so I'm going to make a small change, just maybe there's a new iOS or whatever that I have to be conformed to. Does all of that need to be documented? And do you have to have like letter to file or things like that? Is that
Yeah, so you should definitely have, a change control process that reviews, the impact of the change relative to regulatory, design, risk, testing, usability. So ISO actually calls out, we didn't do a ton here on design changes today, but ISO calls out, as well as FDA, what needs to be considered each time you make a change. And that applies for hardware, software, every type of device. You need to have this formal review of what you're changing and how it affects your product in any phase of the market, right? So, and then additional, if you're in Canada, there's significant change that's different than the US. If you're in the EU, in some cases, you'll have to notify your authorized rep and your notified body when you make these changes as well. So that change process relative to your device should be really well defined, incorporating ISO and FDA, but also any other external regulatory stuff as well.
okay? Great. So the next question is from, let's see here. I had it just a moment ago. Juan asks, how's the process managed when you already sell a device and were exempted from design, I assume design controls in the past, but now want to incorporate design controls into our QMS?
Yeah, so we help a lot of companies with this process of remediating design history files and getting them up to speed with either current regulations or new regulations. I think in general, a lot of FDA products had subpar DHFs. Even if they were class 2 devices, their DHF might have been less than what it should have been. And as FDA started putting more focus on this in audits, a lot of companies kind of were rushing to fix their DHFs and remediate these. So remediation activities to go back and define all of the things we talked about. So your user needs, inputs, outputs for the device, making sure you have proper testing. If there are gaps in testing, exploring when to get that testing done and how to do it. I think this is a thing that is more US focused because the audits aren't regular and there's not a requirement to maintain your 510K testing like there is in the EU, where every time a new standard gets published, you have to kind of either update your testing or update your justification as to why you don't need new testing. So that approach in the FDA is becoming more common, that you need to maintain your DHF and it'll be audited to higher standards and regulations than it was, probably 10, 15 years ago.
Okay. This question is from Ronnie, if I'm pronouncing your name correctly. Can we do all testing in-house, or do we have to get a third party to test, for example, cybersecurity?
Yeah, I think, definitely can get all of your testing done in-house. I think it really depends on your product and whether or not you need external. You can do internal cybersecurity. It's just having a formal protocol, documenting what you're going to test, how you're going to test it, what acceptance criteria is, sample size justification if that applies, and then executing testing.
Okay.
Looks like Etienne dropped off. We can go through and answer a few more questions. We got a question that says, this will be available as a recording. So one question from Matthew, would you include risk benefit analysis in the RMF? Yes, your benefit risk analysis should be in your risk management file. Typically that's in your risk management report, but it can be a separate document as well as part of your risk management file. Answered that one. Sorry, these questions are moving as I'm reading them. Karthik had a question. If the device is a low risk product and is still a SAMD, do we still need formalized risk documentation? Do we still need to demonstrate clinical validation? So you would still need formal risk documentation around your product. The clinical validation would really depend on what your product is, less of formal requirement. No, here comes Etienne. Good.
Can you hear me?
Yeah.
Sorry about that. I lost power.
Oh no!
Don't let me interrupt if you're talking.
No, I was trying to stream through some questions, but they keep moving. So.
Okay. So are you? So let me just catch up to speed here.
I have one for. Is complaint management for SAMD any different than complaint management for other medical devices? I would say no. So you still have to have the same process in place for complaint management. I think the one thing that we have seen that's different is that you potentially could get a lot more feedback just from users of the device, whether it's on an app store, reviews, or actual feedback in the actual software tool. So there's, I think, a lot more access to users directly with SAMD. So that can be definitely an advantage to getting feedback and then responding more proactively with a SAMD compared to a traditional hardware device.
I noticed this one from Shane. I know it's not in the Q&A section, but I think it's a good question. Did you see this one? Is it a good idea or bad idea to have design inputs for non-safety features, example, commercial design features or manufacturing aids? And if so, how do you manage or disposition these if you fail these design inputs during verification?
I personally still include those types of things in your design, and you can mark them or tag them as, not design critical or not regulatory critical. But I still like to keep those in your design matrix. If you fail those, you could then justify why, you made a design decision to move forward, or you're tweaking that, whatever user need design input. But I personally like to keep those in.
Okay. Great.
We have a question from Ramesh around Could you please clarify if your technical file for a SAMD product can contain future scope functionalities as well? So no, I would not do this. So your technical file, especially with the new EU MDR regulations, you should clearly have testing for each functionality of your software as well as each user profile, and that needs to be clearly justified with your clinical data. So any future stuff should be in a design plan or something like that, but will not be in your technical file until you have that final verification and clinical validation data.
Okay. I don't know how far you got through with the Q&A, so are there any in there that stand out to you as good questions?
I don't know, unless you don't have anything. I think we're good.
Okay. You know what? Let's just have like 2 more questions, and I think we just go ahead and shut it down at this point. But Anthony asked, are there any new or emerging standards or requirements for cybersecurity in software as a medical device or software in a medical device? Cybersecurity risk analysis and management is significantly different from patient safety and may be governed by different government agencies, NIST, and industry partners.
Yeah, so I mentioned a little bit that CR 3971 that was published end of January. That's a guidance on risk management for AI and ML devices. I know there was some additional information from the FDA around cybersecurity stuff that came out recently. That's something that I think is ongoingly being updated. So, and as well as the EU is proactively putting out new guidances for these types of things as well. So there are new standards. I think that's something we definitely follow up with on each specific one and how it might relate to his specific device. But yeah, there's definitely more stuff in the works, as well as more coming. I think the FDA is also, proposed last year that they're going to kind of overhaul their entire software plan as far as the level of concern is going to go away, and there's going to be a new basis for grading software and what's required in regulatory submissions. So always updating and getting more information, getting harder on the software side, cybersecurity. The one thing to specifically call out is, some of the ones that you think like FedRAMP, High Trust, NIST certification around cybersecurity, those are traditionally more for company practices and less around the actual device, where the FDA and CE mark is looking specifically at cybersecurity of your device. So how that software device is handling data, transferring data, storing data, that cybersecurity is the main focus.
Okay. I think just one more. I'm trying to find a question that would apply to a lot of different people. So what Sarah asked the question, can design reviews be held via email or is a meeting required?
I think email is fine, right? I recommend, doing a meeting and having minutes, but I think you could still get through an email if you have a remote team and it's formally documented. I think that's fine.
Cool. All right. Thank you, Kyle, for the informative presentation. Really appreciate all the valuable insights you gave.